And then came the secret police and said, you could work for us to prove you were for us and not against us.
I will never get a work again. And the jazz thing is over.
But you were willing to take that risk?
Yes.
Armstrong was the god of the instruments.
In post-war communist East Germany, loving jazz was a dangerous affair.
Oh, the shock has pretty teeth, dear, and it shows them pearly white.
Then in 1965, something strange happened.
Es ist ein nahezu riesenhaftes Heer von Reportern, das auf das Erscheinen von Louis Armstrong wartet.
Sehr geehrter Herr Armstrong, werte Frau Armstrong, ein herzliches Willkommen für Sie in Berlin, ein herzliches Willkommen in der Deutschen Demokratischen Republik.
It's a pleasure and I'm happy and it's a thrill to hear the band playing my theme song.
You couldn't think of a single event taking place in East Germany which was worth more than Armstrong appearing live.
Yeah, and I know we're going to have a nice stay here because I have a lot of friends right here.
Louis Armstrong, the king of jazz, arriving at Schönefeld Airport in East Berlin in 1965 at the height of the Cold War. For jazz fans in East Germany, this was beyond belief. They had grown up in a country that forbade travelling freely to the West and punished those who engaged with a Western lifestyle, including jazz. Now, like a miracle, this American star, who had seemed light years away, had been invited for a concert tour.
Und Louis Armstrong singt mit.
I'm Kevin Legendre, and in this Sunday feature, I'll find out who pulled the strings behind the Iron Curtain to make these legendary concerts happen, and why they were so special.
When it's sleepy time down south.
Someday in the agency, somebody asked me, Mr. Drexel, would you like to announce a tour with Louis Armstrong? I thought it is a joke. Nobody ever spoke about Armstrong in DDR.
Jazz journalist Karl-Heinz Drexel. He's the man who, more than anyone, got to know Louis Armstrong at close quarters while he was performing in East Germany, or the DDR, as East Germans called it. I meet him in Berlin in his study, with shelves of CDs and vinyl records stacked from floor to ceiling, testament to a lifelong dedication to jazz. Having the privilege to introduce Armstrong's concerts even meant sharing the tour bus with him. After the first concerts at the Friedrichstadtpalast in Berlin, the next stop was Leipzig.
Every night he called me into his room. He wanted to speak about jazz.
Drexel's expertise was greatly appreciated by Armstrong. It made the star feel comfortable on this high-profile tour. In Leipzig, they went to great lengths to do the same.
The director of the hotel ordered a grand piano, especially for Louis. And the first floor, it was very difficult to carry the instrument upstairs. I asked, why do you have a piano? And he said, I don't know why. I don't play piano. But nobody in the hotel knew that.
Clearly, the management still had some catching up to do. But for Karl-Heinz Drexel, meeting Louis Armstrong was a dream come true. Drexel's love for jazz began as a child in Dresden during the Second World War. And as a young man under communism, he was one of the key players in paving the way for jazz in East Germany.
I started with founding a jazz club in Dresden.
It was actually a group of like-minded people who listened to records attentively, discussed jazz, and spread the word.
Until it was forbidden.
That was in 1957.
Mr. Montgomery, General, the NATO chief, said when we can't conquer the East by weapons, then we do it by the jazz trumpet. And that was a big reason for the state people in East Germany to say jazz is out.
Karl-Heinz Drechsel was not the only one to endure this kind of oppression. Fellow jazz enthusiast Siegfried Schmidt-Joos also had to find ways to follow his passion without provoking a conflict with the East German authorities, where its leader Walter Ulbricht had shockingly described jazz as imperialistic ape music and just about tolerated it. I meet Schmidt-Joos in his spacious flat in Berlin, which breathes music. He remembers the 1950s.
Jazz was almost forbidden in the DDR, and from the West came via German radio stations as well as AFN, American Forces Network, jazz and swing. But in the radio in the DDR, we didn't have radio programs with jazz. So we had to do something to make it acceptable again for the audience in this part of Germany.
Schmidt-Joos studied in Halle, near Leipzig. Like Drechsel, he also founded a club for jazz lovers.
We started a campaign by making lectures in youth organizations or cultural clubs. In Halle, there was a university dance orchestra who played Dixieland. There were dance orchestras of different kinds. We had a New Orleans band in Jena, we had swing bands, and we tried to organize jazz concerts for them and talk about jazz in our announcements.
But more excitingly, Schmidt-Joos's best friend had a Dixieland band himself, the Alfons Schockelt Jazz Band Halle. And that's them playing. Schmidt-Joos was also friends with the leading campaigner for jazz, Reginald Rudolph. Rudolph was originally a member of East Germany's communist SED party, but was kicked out and put in prison in 1957. It was a consequence of events that had taken place in the Soviet Union. A year earlier, its leader, Nikita Khrushchev, had revealed the horrors carried out by his predecessor, Joseph Stalin. Then, when the revolution against communist rule in Hungary was crushed by Soviet tanks, the East German government tightened its grip.
Everybody who talked about the Khrushchev speech and the Stalin problematic in open in the universities or in restaurants was jailed. So many of our friends and teachers from the university were jailed. And then came the secret police and said, you could work for us to prove you are for us and not against us. And they said, we know you are a good socialist, but then give us information about everybody who is talking bad about the DDR and its leaders and communism in general. They asked for reports about what's going on in your university surrounding and in your jazz club.
Schmidt-Joos didn't want to ruffle any feathers or jeopardize his place at university. But he also wanted to keep his conscience clear. What could he do? He resolved this by writing the requested reports, but with content that was of little use to the authorities. However, the Stasi also operated with underhand tactics.
They tried to seduce us as well, giving us opportunity to invite, in this particular case, a band from West Berlin. We didn't get no permit to make a concert with them. And I said to my officer from the Stasi, we have a problem getting this band into the DDR and make a concert in the university. Helmut Brandt Combo, the then most famous modern jazz group in West Berlin. And he said, okay, we can handle this for you. So we got the permit. It was another way of making us loyal to them.
Then one day, the Stasi asked him to report on a good friend. That's where he drew the line. The only way out was to escape. But how? Leaving the country without permission was a criminal offence. Fortunately, he and his Dixieland friend had already applied for permission to attend the Amateur Jazz Festival in Düsseldorf in West Germany. It was granted. And on the 27th of September 1957, he sat on a train heading west, leaving behind his parents, his brother, and a promising career as a jazz journalist.
Did the authorities make a distinction between, let's say, modern jazz and bebop and swing and older styles?
Yes, the older styles were working man music, and the modern jazz was influenced by American way of life.
I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill.
2 years later, by 1959, Karl-Heinz Drechsel had moved to Berlin and was working in radio. He managed to convince his head of department that jazz music was also the music of America's oppressed black working classes. Eventually, he was given a permanent slot that allowed him to play some jazz on air, including Louis Armstrong. However, the record shelves at the radio station had nothing for that program. He had to draw on his personal collection, and getting hold of new records was his responsibility.
That was the biggest problem of all. We had the black market. If you wanted jazz, you knew you have to speak with a special person.
Except for rare pressings of East Germany's own Amiga label, obtaining jazz records remained, somewhat paradoxically, illegal. That meant smuggling records across the border from the West. But then one night the Berlin Wall suddenly appeared, cutting him off from the West. Afterwards, getting records became even more dangerous.
There was a man in West Germany. He collected records from clubs and from jazz friends. And sometimes he came with his car to Berlin on the Autobahn. But he had to pass the GDR. And a friend of mine was his friend. And he got always a letter when he was coming. And he wrote in his letter, at that time I will be at landmark number so and so. I will put all the records out of the window. You have to collect them. And on the Autobahn were the police from East Germany. And by that way, we brought the records in the night.
So it's almost like a secret society.
It was an underground thing, yes, of course. It was dangerous for my friend and me. My wife was strong against it. She said, you are working at the radio. When they capture you, you will be
thrown out.
Yes, and the jazz thing is over.
But you were willing to take that risk?
Yes.
While Karl-Heinz Drechsel gambled with his career for the sound of jazz, Siegfried Schmidt-Joos also continued to keep his former countrymen tuned into the jazz scene from his new base in West Germany. He worked for the magazine Schlagzeug, meaning drums, which was distributed to addresses behind the Iron Curtain. It was even involved in the so-called jazz lift, which covertly sent jazz records to the East. At the same time, young jazz aficionados continued forming bands. In Leipzig, the student Volker Stieler was one of them.
Such, I can't forget.
He welcomes me into his living room, where we start chatting in English. A signed Louis Armstrong poster adorns the wall, a newspaper clipping is on the table, and a trombone on the side. What's the story?
I started a Dixieland company in the university in Leipzig in 1960. So I heard more and more the swing and the Dixieland music, and Armstrong was, for me, I trumpetist, the god of the instrument, but only to hear.
And then, one day, in early 1965,
we learned at the beginning of the year, I think in January, that Armstrong would come. There were posters, and it was in the newspapers. There was not much to advertise. Everybody in the jazz community was talking about it.
Of course, Volker Stieler had one of the hot tickets to see Armstrong on stage, yet nothing could match this personal encounter.
It was like the king coming to his people. It was almost a royal or divine atmosphere. We were in seventh heaven.
He points to the photo in the newspaper clipping. It shows Stieler at the airport in Leipzig with a band and Louis Armstrong. So how did he meet him? Well, he was friends with an amateur jazz band called the Kabul Dandies. They heard how another group, the Jazz Optimists, had welcomed Armstrong at the airport in Berlin, and they wanted to do the same in Leipzig. Then their trombone player dropped out, and Volker Stieler stepped in. He remembers the plane coming nearer and nearer, coming to a halt, and the opening of the door was the cue to play Georgia on My Mind.
Ich weiß nicht, was ich gefühlt habe. Ich habe erst mal nur gespielt.
I can't remember how I felt. I just played and asked myself how that would sound to Armstrong. Because we were trembling as we played. But the way Armstrong was, he came down the gangway, stood there laughing and said,
"Take it easy, boys."
He was having such fun. I don't think he could be serious in a negative sense. He was always cheerful.
Georgia, 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 Georgia. Seine Nähe strahlt so viel.
He radiated so much warmth, which could still be felt when he was on stage.
Überrascht hat natürlich, wie groß
we were surprised about the amount of people interested in the concerts.
Konzerten interessiert war.
That's Ronald Trisch, who plays a crucial role in this story. He worked for the artists agency in East Germany, which was responsible for arranging Louis Armstrong's tour there. But the authorities despised jazz. So what caused the change of heart that enabled Louis Armstrong to come to East Germany in the first place? While jazz slowly established itself in East Germany, beat music, a forerunner to rock, had crept into the country and caused the authorities a much greater headache as they feared out-of-control teenagers. More importantly, in 1961, East Germany had built the Berlin Wall to prevent the country from collapsing. Until then, almost 3 million people had left their homes to seek a better life in the West. Now the wall publicly showed how the communist government oppressed its people. To counter its negative image on the international stage, and as a sign of appeasement, East Germany wanted to offer its people at least some of the sparkle that was available in the West.
Zu dieser Zeit, als die Mauer stand, war es wichtig.
At the time, when the wall was standing, it was politically important that we have contact with West European, Japanese and American artists, so that it appeared a bit more relaxed for the people here,
Eingeschlossenheit der Menschen,
who were relatively confined, because they now could also go to concerts which they couldn't attend before.
auch Konzerte besuchen konnten, die sie bis dahin nicht besucht haben.
Hosting these international stars was also a means to show off, boost East Germany's reputation and gain respect. In the 1960s, it was not diplomatically recognised as a legitimate state by many other countries, including the US. So Louis Armstrong's visit had become a real propaganda coup.
Ich glaube, das war 2 Jahre vorher, also 63.
I think the idea was born 2 years before, in 1963. We didn't do it by ourselves. The tour was organised by several countries of the Eastern Bloc. We, the directors of the artists' agencies of the Eastern Bloc, met up every year. There, the Hungarians, I think, informed us that they intended to invite Louis Armstrong for a tour.
Louis Armstrong einzuladen.
The East German authorities gave their seal of approval to the tour, as Armstrong was also playing in other Eastern Bloc countries.
Das größte Problem war dabei die Finanzierung.
The biggest problem was the financing, because we mainly only had East German marks, which were not transferable.
In addition to that, you couldn't just ring Armstrong's manager in New York and send an invite. Getting the king of jazz behind the Iron Curtain finally came down to one man, Werner Schmid. Ronald Trisch explains.
Wir hatten einen sehr guten Partner in der Schweiz.
We had a very good partner in Switzerland, the Schmid Agency. He also hosted the Louis Armstrong concerts in other East European countries.
East Germany provided spending money for Louis and his band, the All-Stars, and the best hotels free of charge. However, Werner Schmid's bill still needed paying. It was a handsome sum that included the payment of the artists in dollars. but there was no money at hand to pay him. So they struck a deal which involved East German-owned antiques being shipped to Switzerland. On the other side of the pond, how did Louis Armstrong react to the offer of playing in East Germany?
Armstrong was definitely keen to go behind the Iron Curtain because he knew how much those fans loved him. Armstrong always told stories of performing in West Berlin, and people would come from East Berlin, they would come from Russia, and that always impressed him that these people would kind of put their lives on the line just to go see him.
Louis Armstrong biographer Ricky Riccardi. Nonetheless, Armstrong's management had its demands. The venues. They had to have a capacity of at least 3,000 seats, and there were not many of those in East Germany. Solving this problem required some creative thinking. In Leipzig, for example, a huge hall normally used for the International Trade Fair served as a concert hall.
The hall was going to be packed, absolutely packed, and they were coming from all over East Germany.
Louis Armstrong playing East Germany was a sensation, yet only a few journalists from the West reported on it. Leslie Collett was one of them, and he covered it for the New York Times. It was a pure stroke of luck that he happened to be in East Germany. When he arrived in Leipzig that day, there was already a buzz in the air, because the city, unlike others, had loudspeakers.
They played music normally, and the announcements for things that were going on. It was the party's message to the population.
And that day it said,
"Welcome to Louis Armstrong and his band, and he's come to East Germany. We're going to show him how enthusiastic and how great we think he is."
And they sure did.
It was just the most frenetic applause and the most frenetic cries of enthusiasm that you could imagine. And it went on for at least 10 minutes before he even got a chance to sing.
And there, centre stage, all by himself, was Karl-Heinz Drechsel with the responsibility of introducing the king of jazz.
I thought, what shall I do? Because I'm the first who goes on stage before the band comes. And the audience is high-powered.
Really excited.
And I'm just a German coming on stage. Everybody knows about Louis Armstrong, but he had a very good band.
Oh, thank you very much, folks. We're going to keep it rolling for you, because right now you're going to hear from our clarinet man. It is sure.
Billy Kyle on piano, Danny Barcelona, Abel Shaw, Eddie Schuh, the only white musician in the band. Terry Glenn, trombone. And I thought, I'd tell the people a little story about the musicians. They are not known to the audience. I was very surprised in the interval. Louis and his musicians came. They didn't speak German, but they could understand a lot of names I mentioned. And Louis said in the name of his band he will thank. It's the very first time that his musicians are introduced to the audience. It's always himself, never the others.
Which included the vocalist Jewel Brown. So everything was going according to plan until suddenly on stage, Louis Armstrong felt a crack in his tooth. Being a consummate professional, he winced through the pain, so no one noticed that something was wrong. But afterwards, he was in desperate need of a dentist. Ronald Trisch was quick to find one.
He was thrilled, despite the pain, about the treatment he received. He couldn't believe that it didn't cost him anything. He said in the US he would have had to pay several $100s, but here it was taken for granted.
And then Ronald Trisch made a telling remark.
Es gab keine Vorbehalte gegen Personen anderer Hautfarbe.
There were no reservations towards people with a different skin color, especially not black Americans. On the contrary, they were particularly welcome, and contact with them was sought after.
This hints at another political undercurrent during the Cold War. With the communist East and the capitalist West competing through their social systems, the East was keen to point out a major flaw of the United States: segregation. Already in the 1950s, the State Department had organised a tour for the black American artist Dizzy Gillespie to play in the Middle East to boost the United States' reputation. Dave Brubeck was sent to Poland to play behind the Iron Curtain with his racially mixed band. These artists became known as the Jazz Ambassadors. And in 1960, Louis Armstrong too packed his suitcase for a State Department tour. However, not behind the Iron Curtain, but to countries in Africa, including Ghana, Nigeria and the Congo, where something incredible happened.
There was a civil war going on, and both sides actually called a truce because Louis Armstrong was coming, and he performed with his band for 3 hours, flew back, and the next day the war resumed.
Despite the international success and overwhelming enthusiasm abroad for their jazz music, black American artists found themselves in a conundrum. They represented their country that preached democracy and freedom, but ironically withheld it from them. A few years earlier, in 1957, negotiations had been underway for Armstrong to play in the Soviet Union. But when in Little Rock, Arkansas, Governor Orville Forbes called in the National Guard to illegally stop 9 black American pupils from attending an all-white school, Armstrong withdrew.
He said, the way they're treating my people in the South, the government can go to hell. President Eisenhower has no guts for letting Faubus run the country. The amazing thing is it worked, but what always haunted Armstrong was he really put his career on the line to speak out against injustice, and he got a lot of criticism.
So he fell so silent on the subject that he was often reproached for not being actively involved in the civil rights movement.
This march will not continue.
However, after a landmark civil rights march in 1965 in Selma, Alabama, was attacked by police, he broke his silence.
Armstrong said, maybe I'm not in the front line, but I support them with my donation. My life is music. They would beat me on the mouth if I marched, and without my mouth, I would not be able to blow my horn.
It was the height of the civil rights movement. Armstrong's strong feelings about it became evident when he gave his concerts a political undertone. Since his shows in Prague, he had reintroduced into his repertoire a song he had not played since the Little Rock incident.
The third song of the night is always, without fail, What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue? Slower than Armstrong ever performed it, more dramatic than he had ever performed it, and with one very telling change in the lyrics.
Yes, I'm right inside, but that don't help my case.
The original lyrics, written by Andy Razaf, said, I'm white inside, but that don't help my case. In East Berlin and Prague, Armstrong changed it to, I'm right inside, but that don't help my case. A very, very telling change, and I think a very important change.
How would it end? Ain't got a friend. My only sin is in my skin.
Ich darf mit großer Freude diese Pressekonferenz eröffnen.
After Armstrong had arrived in East Berlin, he gave a press conference where he was again probed about his involvement in the civil rights movement.
I'm so busy traveling and blowing the horn and singing. The best we can do, I can do, is probably donation, things like that. I mean, I can't just ignore the situation. But still in all, they have other people, politicians, to take care of things like that.
There's more diplomacy from Armstrong on the race issue.
I love everybody. I mean, the white people, they're my greatest fans all through the South. We stay in the best hotels.
And a clarification about his relationship to his white manager.
Wherever they say you play, that's where I play. I don't ask no questions. So when he say you go here, you go there, I say, okay, Daddy, thanks for the extra gig.
But that was only one side of the story. Karl-Heinz Drechsel actually saw Armstrong taking a stand against racism.
On the way to Magdeburg, we had little problem with the touring bus. And the driver made a stop in this very, very, very small village. And the band went into the only restaurant in the village. And within some minutes, the room was filled with children. They all wanted autographs. And suddenly the driver, touring manager, yes, came in. And he was very unfriendly. Let the children go. We must start. He was very angry about the All-Stars giving autographs. And Louis said, the world is changing. Your time is over. And I gave my autographs as long as I want. You have not to command. I wondered about Louis, that he spoke in such a way to a white man. He was always willing.
So there was another side of him that maybe the general public didn't see.
Nobody knew that side.
Yeah, but you saw it.
I saw it, I heard it.
They laugh at you, scorn you too.
I think he was not a comic figure. He was very diplomatic.
To be so black and blue.
Back at the East German press conference, Armstrong's diplomatic skills shone through again when he had to navigate another touchy subject, the Berlin Wall.
I've seen the wall when I played the concert. I ain't worried about the wall, I'm worried about the audience I'm going to play to tomorrow night.
And then he gets quite fed up with being drawn into this political quagmire.
I can't say what I want to say, but if you accept it, I'll say it. Forget about all that other bullshit.
Strong words. But East Germans remained proud of Armstrong's visit, and his presence was exploited enthusiastically for many purposes. Journalist Stefan Schulz has written a book about Armstrong's tour in East Germany, and during his research, he came across an intriguing picture.
There is a photo in which Louis Armstrong was placed in front of a television made in the GDR. That photo was then used in catalogues which the GDR used for advertising. They did try to use this international star to show that we in the GDR also have great products. But he wasn't asked beforehand. Today, you will get sued for that.
The thought of an American celebrity drawing such audiences in East Germany still left other sections of the state suspicious. So what do the files of the Secret Service, the Stasi, reveal?
I thought that I would get many Stasi documents for the book because the security services kept a lot of people under surveillance back then in the GDR. Strangely, I only found one document. It was an instruction of the Stasi in Leipzig, so this refers to the concerts in Leipzig. There, a major says that teenagers who had already drawn attention to themselves in a negative way at previous dance events should be watched by unofficial informants of the Stasi to see if any teenagers were acting provocatively. For the Stasi, a provocation could already mean that you had danced a bit wildly or shown the wrong flag, such as the American one.
But none of that happened at the concerts. After Leipzig, Louis Armstrong had a brief engagement in West Germany and then played in Romania, Yugoslavia and Bulgaria before he returned to East Germany to give concerts in the cities of Magdeburg, Erfurt and Schwerin.
While roaming round a little German town, we found his love song with a brand new sound. Now I don't speak German, so day by day we wrote these lyrics in a sad small way.
The shows featured more than 20 songs. Of course, East Germany didn't miss the opportunity to capture the highlight for posterity, and they recorded one of the East Berlin concerts for television. It was very fortunate.
The East Berlin concert kind of represents the last hurrah, you could say, of Armstrong at the peak of his powers. During the end of this Iron Curtain tour, he actually began having trouble with his teeth. So when he came back home to America, Armstrong had major dental work done. He went back to work in June of 1965, but after a few months, something was wrong. He could no longer hit those high notes like he used to. His trumpet playing becomes more erratic. Certain songs that he had performed for decades disappeared completely from his live performances. But in East Berlin, he is on fire. One song after another, Indiana, Black and Blue, demanding numbers. This is a man in his mid-60s, and the sound of his trumpet so beautifully captured.
Louis Armstrong's tour was an unparalleled success and brought more than the East German government had bargained for.
Armstrong was door opener, and even the bands in the GDR had more chances to play. That was a fact that the government didn't want. They invited Louis. I think it was a prestige. And now there was an open door for jazz. But Louis played another kind of jazz as many other bands.
Louis Armstrong played traditional jazz, which was deemed more acceptable than the modern or free jazz that followed. Nevertheless, modern jazz gained a foothold in East Germany as well. It was influenced by West German musicians such as Albert Mangelsdorff, who'd been allowed to play in East Germany and encouraged East German musicians to find their own style. The emerging jazz was often showcased in concert series such as Jazz in der Kammer, which premiered in Berlin in 1965 in the wake of Armstrong's tour. And in December that year,
bei der Auswahl der DDR All-Stars 65 ging ich vor allem davon aus,
Karl-Heinz Drechsel hosted the DDR All-Star Jazz Concert, celebrating the best of contemporary East German jazz. One musician who has shaped the East German free jazz scene is the pianist Ulrich Gumpert. A supply teacher shared some jazz with his class when he was a teenager. It left him spellbound. A few years later, at midnight, he carefully tuned into a station belonging to the so-called enemy.
In the mid-60s, we always listened from midnight to 1 o'clock. This is the Voice of America, Jazz Hour. Wallace Conover speaking on medium wave. The signal kept disappearing and then returned. And in 1968, a few of us met up in the youth club. There we could just experiment with free jazz.
And across the border in Poland, there was an event for jazz fans behind the Iron Curtain, which was not to be missed.
From about 1970, we went to Warsaw every year. There was the Jazz Jamboree Festival, and there we heard the American stars. I heard Monk, the Duke Ellington Orchestra. In 1972, I made recordings with a smuggled tape recorder of one of our concerts. At the end of October, we were in Warsaw, and I had a copy of the tape with me. There was the artistic director of the Jazz Jamboree, and who was standing next to him? Wallace Conover of Voice of America. And Baby Summer from my band kept nudging me in the side. Give the tape to Wallace Conover. Imagine us on the Voice of America. And I said, no, New York is still a bit too far away. We have to conquer Warsaw first. So I gave the tape to the Warsawian, and promptly we were invited there for the following year.
And the rise of jazz in East Germany started to have exactly the liberating effect the authorities had feared when they originally banned it. In the early 1970s, Gumpert founded his own band, Sock, which played jazz rock. He still also played free jazz, which developed a great following. This manifested itself in the Free Jazz Festival in the small village of Peitz, which began in 1970 and attracted an immense audience.
More and more people were coming from abroad, from Western countries, not just Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary. We played together there, and there truly was a sense of freedom.
Through this exchange with Western artists, it became evident that East German jazz was much appreciated abroad, and artists were invited to perform in the West. It became a successful export. Gumpert was lucky enough to be one of those who could make the journey.
The music was lost on the authorities. At some point, they simply noticed they could export our music and make a little bit of money from it. So they just let us get on with it. But they still tried to keep us under Stasi control. Yet they could not pin us down because we worked non-verbally, only with music, without texts.
He doesn't consider the free jazz made in East Germany to be overtly political, but admits that it did have a political effect.
We possibly, with our music, our free jazz, contributed a bit to the end of the GDR.
So in the end, NATO's Field Marshal Montgomery was right. If we can't conquer the communist East by weapons, then we will do it with jazz trumpets. After the fall of the wall in 1989, Schmidt-Joos, who had fled to the West to escape the Stasi, read his Stasi files and discovered that the jazz magazine he wrote for was actually financed by the CIA. While on the surface jazz was used as a propaganda tool by the two great Cold War rivals, the East and the West, the music connected people on a much deeper level. And back in the mid-60s, when Armstrong was performing in East Germany, there was an unspoken understanding that each had of the other. While black Americans were discriminated against and fought for civil rights, East Germans too were oppressed and longed for basic human rights such as the freedom to travel, speak freely, and not fear for their Western treasures being confiscated, as Ulrich Gumpert remembers.
I had a classmate who wasn't a boarder, and I borrowed 2 singles from him, Louis Armstrong's Hot 5 and Hot 7. And in the morning, after you had gone to class, some teacher would inspect your room, and they found these 2 singles. At lunchtime, I was immediately summoned to the headmaster's office. I was told off with the words, "You have brought imperialistic ideas into our socialist boarding school." I received a strict reprimand and the threat of being expelled. The joke was, about half a year later, you could buy the first Armstrong record in the GDR.
Then he was lucky enough to attend Louis Armstrong's concert in Erfurt.
The Thuringia Hall was a gigantic hall. I sat somewhere at the back, but of course it was fantastic. There's such row. Everyone sat in their seats, very well behaved. No one moved or leapt up and began to dance or anything, nothing. Of course I don't move either, but it all went inside where it moved.
It made a big impression on East German jazz fans. And for Louis Armstrong?
I think it was a very important tour for Armstrong. When he came back, he actually had scrapbooks filled with photographs, newspaper clippings, seeing these people, meeting these people, seeing the reaction. He felt it very deeply.
So 2 years later, Louis Armstrong wrote a letter.
My dear Mr. Karl-Heinz Drechsel, surprise, surprise. You must have thought that I had forgotten you, but I did not. I thought about you ever since you and I were together, and you were the MC of our show, and you did a very wonderful job. One of the very best that we have ever had. Jazzily was Satchel Louis Armstrong.
Cold War in full swing at Louis Armstrong in the GDR was presented by Kevin Legendre. The readers were David Hounslow, Sean Baker and Thomas Becker. It was produced by Zabina Shereg.